So following are the applications of descriptive programming. Um the first is operation of dynamically changing object descriptions. Okay, the one of the most important reason why do we use descriptive programming is if the object description is changing dynamically. So what happens is if you capture the object description of a particular object and if the description is changing the next day, QTP won't be able to recognize the object using object repository. But if you are using descriptive programming instead for the dynamically changing description object description, then QTP can successfully identify the object. So I'll explain you this with an help of an example. So we start with the adding object, okay, checkbox object in our object repository. So I'll show you why I'm adding this to the object repository. So my QTP, I'll go to object repository. I'll add the object checkbox. Okay. And I drag this object to my code, and it will click will do what we'll do is we'll set on the checkbox, that is it will click on the set checkbox. When I run this code, you will see that it has checked the first checkbox. Okay, now my script requirement says that I have to check the different checkboxes. Okay, 1 2 3 4 5. So now using object repository, what I'll do is I'll add the second object as well. I'll add this object as well, and then I'll add the third object as well. So I'll add different objects, all the 5 objects in my object repository. Okay, my 5 objects, as you can see, department 1 2 3 4 5. These are the logical names given by developer to the QTP to the checkboxes. I have added the 5 names, the 5 objects to my object repository. Now what I'll do is I'll just drag them, okay, to my code. So I just want to check all the object box, check all the check boxes in my code. So I'll simply write set on for all of them. So by default, the checkboxes will be off. So when I run this code, what will happen is all the checkboxes will be set one by one. So as you can see, all the 5 checkboxes have been set. But one thing you'll notice is I have increased the lines of code. Okay, don't you think that for in our case we have only 5 checkbox. Now say for example there's this application, the page of which is having 100 checkboxes. So do you think it is feasible enough to add 100 objects to our object repository? That is, we'll add all the objects. The 100 objects will take the unnecessary space of the in object repository. Also, we'll write 100 lines of code for each and every object, for each and every checkboxes. So it is actually not that feasible, and that's why we can use descriptive programming in this case. Now how? Let's see. Now one thing you'll notice is when I see the property of this, I'll I'll see the property of my checkbox. So you'll see that the name for the name property is having value department 1 for the first checkbox. It is having value department 2 for the second checkbox, and so on. So from this you can see, suppose I am using a single line of code, okay, and suppose the object description is changing, that is department 1, department 2, department 3, and using that single line of code. So this object property is dynamically varying, that is the name, suppose which is department 1, department 2, department 3. So single line of code has the description as a property name, which is dynamically changing every time. So in that case it will be very feasible to use a single line of code. In our case it is 5 checkboxes. It will be very feasible in case we have 100 checkboxes to use a single line of code. So I'll show you what we can do is, so first of all I just need to manipulate with my property for the web checkbox. So the browser and the page I can keep in the object repository, and I can use descriptive programming for web checkbox. Okay, so I'll go to my object repository. To use descriptive programming for my checkboxes, I need to delete them from the object repository in the first place, because I don't need them. So I'll delete all of them one by one. Okay, now if you see, my object repository has only the browser class and the page class, and we'll use descriptive programming for web checkbox. Now to uniquely identify the web checkbox in the page, the first properties of obviously the class name. So I'm using the property value pair for my web checkbox. So let's see, class name will be web checkbox. Now I can just straight away copy paste web checkbox over here. Now this is my first property value pair, but this is not enough to uniquely identify the checkbox, right? Because if I select this, it will my page has 5 checkboxes. So QTP will get confused which checkbox to select, and it will throw an error because it is not uniquely able to identify which checkbox it has to check. So I'll use my second property value pair. So it will be name in this class. I'm sorry. So when I click on the checkbox, you'll see that the name is dpt1. Okay, so I can use this property. You'll see that everything is in small. We have name dpt1, everything in small, so we can use this property value pair dpt1. Okay, so what this code will do is it will it will set the first object, the first checkbox, to on. So by default, let's say all the checkboxes are in off position, and when I run this code, it will just set the first checkbox on. So as you can see, QTP successfully identified the first checkbox. Now to use the same code for different checkboxes, that is, I am dynamically varying the property of property name, which is having value department 1. Now what I can do is I can vary this to department 2, 3, 4, 5 for a single line of code, and then I can put it in a loop, that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The loop will run 5 times and all the checkboxes will be set. Okay, So you are aware about how a loop works. I had explained you about the for loop in the sample codes which I had sample and so on, which we had done earlier. So you should be comfortable with using the loop. Okay. So for let's say I equal to 1 to 5. Okay. I'm just hard coding it because I'm showing you an example. In real time, maybe you don't have to hard code it. You can parameterize it. You can use a variable. So for the sake of understanding, I'm explaining you using hard coding. So since we have to use it for 5 checkboxes, I'm using for I equal to 1 to 5, and here we are